Hi, I'm Mushiri, and this is Let's Talk Data, the Maputo Protocol edition. And today I'm with Irũngũ Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty Kenya, Amnesty International Kenya. And this is going to be an interesting conversation with someone who was there at the beginning of the protocol's journey. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Mushiri.
Yeah. So just to get started, we met when in the context of the Pan-Africanist movement and the organization of the Pan-African Conference. So I know you as a political scientist, a historian. Mm-hmm. How did you end up going from what we think about political science in the normal sense, working within the spaces of policy and political issues, to working on the Maputo Protocol and the gender agenda for Africa?
So I guess my background, it's probably a 20-year passion for women's rights and freedom from sexual violence. In 1998, I was studying history and African political science. And in the campus that we were in, which is the University of Dar es Salaam, a woman, a Tanzanian woman, committed suicide because she had been stigmatized and routinely abused by an underground society in the university called Punch. And they had a habit of embarrassing people by drawing cartoons and illustrations on the side of a wall. And this went on for a couple of weeks, nobody interrupted it, and this poor woman committed suicide, took an overdose and died. She had been accused by the underground society of essentially having sexual relationships with sugar daddies.
Oh, wow.
So there was a wake-up call for me. So back then in 1998, we organized a activist group on campus to basically do gender awareness training. Now, 3 years later, I had returned back to Kenya, and there was an incident which is fairly infamous now called the St. Kizito killings, yes, where we saw up to 69 girls raped, yeah, and I think just over 10 or so were suffocated or stampeded to death, and it was a real wake-up call for the country. So I joined something called Mothers in Action. And I was with Kivuda Kibwana, the only two men who were activists in that space. Mm-hmm. We called ourselves Honorary Mothers in Action. I was also there at the Freedom Corner when the mothers of political prisoners took action, and I ran supplies and support for that community, including water on the day that they were tear-gassed. Mm-hmm. And Wangara Maathai was then rushed to hospital having passed out from the violence that was seen. So this has been a long history. In 2003 I joined Oxfam, and it was clear to me then that we needed to do a lot more in terms of gender justice and solidarity with African women. And this is what then became the campaign under the auspices of the Solidarity for African Women's Rights Coalition. It initially was 4 organizations: Femnet, Equality Now, mm-hmm, Oxfam, and Fahamu. And the veterans at that time were Mary Wandia, Faiza Jama Mohammed, and Firoz Manji, and myself. And we formed essentially the SWA coalition. And what was clear to us there was that the protocol on the rights of women in Africa, or the Maputo Protocol, was probably not going to get endorsed by African governments and implemented at home unless there was a domestic pressure that was built up from within those countries for its implementation. So that's what we set out to do. And looking back at that period, what's really exciting is that the 4-member coalition grew into 29 members and then over 30 members. And we were able to attract a great deal of resources, funding, to be able to do work in the countries. Yeah. And many of the women's rights leaders that you now see across the continent at some point will have passed through that coalition. That coalition.
It's interesting when you talk about the genesis of your involvement in the issue and the lady who unfortunately died in Dar es Salaam. It seems as if the more things change, the more they stay the same. Yeah. Because you had this underground, movement that was doing this, Punch.
Yeah, Punch.
And now it's online. Mm-hmm. The same underground trolls. Mm-hmm. Now
have smartphones
and are using a different kind of wall now. It's a Facebook wall.
Yeah, or some other kind of online. I think we have to look at it at probably three levels. One is structurally. So are we seeing transformative change in terms of gender inequalities in our countries? Access to land, access to credit, freedom from violence. These are I guess, what you call the structural issues. And we have seen movement in some ways. The second one is really around political change. And what I'm present to really is when the protocol came in 2003, very few countries had protective legislation on gender offences, on sexual offences. Many of them were not discussing issues of FGM or female genital mutilation, or were they discussing issues around detention of women in hospitals for not paying their bills.
Yeah.
Now, the protocol basically in that context was revolutionary. Right? It raised, for the first time in any international instrument, sexual and reproductive health rights. It had very clear clauses on cultural practices that were harmful to women, including female genital mutilation. Many laws across the continent have changed as a result of that. And I would argue probably even enforcement of those laws. It's now possible to make claims on the state in terms of the legal frameworks. The Kenyan constitution, the clauses related to the Bill of Rights were informed by the protocol.
Yeah.
So this is the second level. The third level is the real lives, are the lives of women and girls changing dramatically across the continent? And I think this is where it's much more patchy. Yeah. So in some parts of the world, it is true that you are seeing upward mobility, you are seeing greater employment access, you are seeing greater visibility and voice and agency among women citizens. So I'm present to many things and stories that we could tell about how women came together and actually took action on certain things.
On certain issues.
Yeah. 2014 in Kenya, for example, the My Dress, My Choice campaign. Was really a citizen's spontaneous response to stripping of women in public service vehicles.
Yeah.
And I think those are the examples that I have. But there are also other cases, just to give you a sense. Last year we had 12 to 15 women locked in either basements or on floors of hospital facilities because they couldn't pay the extra charges that came with childbirth and maternity health care. There is a case in Sudan that Amnesty is very concerned about, which is the case of Nuria. Nuria was underage, under the age of majority, under the age of 18, when she was married off to a relative. The relative then proceeded with other relatives to rape her in order to break her spirit. She then took action and in self-defense killed her husband. The court then has applied a murder charge. So she's actually facing a death penalty in Sudan. And I think cases like this really show the dangers that the girls have of being married off before they are women. So child marriages is still a very important issue that we need to work on. The second area, the third area now I think that we have to think a little bit more about is the area of the protection of women, not just in moments of safety, I guess what you say, moments of conflict, but also moments of non-conflict. So we've seen the Bring Girls Back campaign in northern Nigeria. But we also need to be present that our schools, our homes, our workspaces are still not safe spaces for women. And I think this brings me to the second point, which is that all these things, which are, I guess, what you'd call challenges, continued challenges, that do not translate into safety and dignity for women, are also being challenged.
Yeah.
So I'm very present to, a number of campaigns across the continent and even globally that relate to how do we keep, girls and women safe in all the spaces there are. The Me Too campaign, which then led to the campaign around Time's Up, or the Time Is Up campaign. For me, is probably the most interesting development in the last 20 years of the women's movement. It's global, it's going to all the sectors, the non-profit sector and Oxfam have not been exempt from this. It's gone into the entertainment world. So I think, you know, what we're starting to see is a growing recognition that actually intimidation, stigma, and sexual harassment is unacceptable, whatever spaces they come in.
And time's up.
And time is up, completely. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is we're starting to see some very edgy campaigns around the right to reproductive health, safe abortion, and also sexual education in schools. Right? Now, if I think back to 2003, this was, you know, an anathema in many ways. But now what you're seeing is in several countries, this is now being very strongly debated and actually legislated and litigated through our courts. And
I'd like development. And I'd like us to come back to that, especially once the protocol started getting its legs, and began to make progress in terms of the number of countries ratifying it. That period before it came into force and after it came into force. But we'll take a little break and we'll be right back.